The hot sun beat down on Jake Carter's back as he wiped the sweat from his brow. This land, his land, was more than just property. It was his grandfather's legacy, passed down through generations. A piece of history that had survived time, storms, and struggle. But today, standing in the middle of his newly inherited land, Jake felt his stomach churn with something he never expected: rage. Because someone was trespassing. Not just trespassing, acting like they owned the place. A woman in expensive sunglasses and a designer tracksuit stood in the center of his field, her small dog yapping at her feet. She held herself with the kind of arrogance that screamed, "I'm better than you and I know it." She wasn't just standing there. She was surveying the land like a queen inspecting her kingdom. Jake took a deep breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is private property. I need you to leave." The woman turned, barely acknowledging him. She had the self-satisfied smirk of someone who had never been told no in her life. "I know," she said flippantly, as if that was supposed to make sense. Jake frowned. "So, you'll leave?" She actually laughed. "Oh, honey," she said, tilting her sunglasses down just enough to look him up and down, sizing him up like he was nothing. "You must be new around here. This land, it's public. Everyone uses it. I've been walking my dog here for years." Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No, this is private property. I own it. You're trespassing." Her smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew wider. "Sweetheart," she said, voice dripping with condescension, "I don't think you understand. I live just over there." She gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood beyond the trees. "I've always used this land. My friends have used it. It's practically mine. So you can't just show up here and tell me what to do." Jake felt heat rise in his chest. Not just from the sun, but from the sheer audacity of this woman. He had spent the last few weeks cleaning up the land, fixing fences, and preparing to build something meaningful here. And now, some entitled stranger was acting like his family's land was her personal park. "Lady," Jake said, voice tight, "I don't care if you've been walking here since the dinosaurs. This is my land. Get off." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "Wow, so aggressive," she said, clutching her chest like she was offended. "And so rude. No wonder no one's ever heard of you before." Jake's jaw clenched. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to put an end to this nonsense. "Leave," he said, stepping forward. Karen's hand flew to her phone. Jake paused, heart pounding, as he saw her finger tap 911 on the screen. "I'd back off if I were you," she said sweetly, pressing call. "Because I'm feeling very threatened right now." Jake's stomach dropped. Was this really happening? 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end of the call. Karen gasped dramatically. "Yes, officer, send someone fast. There's a dangerous man trespassing on my property, threatening me." Jake stared at her, dumbfounded. Had he just stepped into some kind of Twilight Zone? Before he could even think, Karen lifted her chin triumphantly and said the words that made Jake's blood boil. "Arrest him, officer. He's on MY land. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this." Jake took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself not to lose his temper. This had to be a joke. He turned his back to Karen, pulling out his own phone. "Fine," he muttered, scrolling through his camera feed. "Let's see what the sheriff thinks about this." "Excuse me?" Karen snapped. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake ignored her. He pulled up the security footage, clear as day, showing her waltzing onto his land, acting like she owned the place. A smug little chuckle slipped out of him as he hit send, sending the footage straight to the local police department. Karen's smirk faltered. What did you just do?" she demanded. Jake turned back to her, finally letting a slow, knowing grin stretch across his face. "I just made sure the cops know the truth before they even get here," he said. Karen's face drained of color. She had called 911 to trap him, She never expected him to have evidence against her. Now, she was in real trouble. The distant wail of sirens sent a chill through the humid air. Karen stood with her arms folded, that same smug smirk plastered across her face, as if she had already won. Jake didn't move. He stood firm, arms crossed, his phone still in hand. He had sent the footage, and now all he had to do was wait. A white and blue patrol car pulled up, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. The door swung open, and Deputy Collins stepped out. Jake recognized him immediately. Collins was no nonsense, the kind of guy who could see through people's games. But at the same time, he hated drama, and if Karen played her cards right, she could make things very difficult. Karen, of course, went straight into performance mode. "Oh, officer, thank God you're here," she cried, running toward him like a damsel in distress. "This man, he refuses to leave my property. I told him over and over again, but he got aggressive." Jake could practically hear the invisible violins playing. Collins sighed and adjusted his belt, already looking exhausted. "All right, ma'am, slow down. What exactly happened here?" Karen's hands fluttered dramatically, as if she were on the verge of fainting. "I was just out here walking my dog, like I always do, when he came out of nowhere, screaming at me. He was threatening me, saying he'd call people to hurt me." Jake's hands clenched into fists, his breath coming out slow and steady. She was really doing this. Collins turned to him, expression unreadable. "Sir, is that true?" Jake met the officer's gaze without flinching. "No, it's not. She's trespassing. This is my land." Karen snorted. "Liar." Jake took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Officer, I have proof. Security footage. I already sent it to the department." That wiped the smirk off Karen's face. Collins narrowed his eyes. "You did?" Jake nodded, pulling out his phone. "Want me to show you?" Karen's entire demeanor shifted. She took a step forward, smiling sweetly, trying a new angle. "Oh, that won't be necessary, officer," she said in a syrupy voice. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I may have gotten a little confused about the property lines." Jake nearly laughed out loud. So now it was a misunderstanding? Collins wasn't buying it. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "All right, both of you, stay put." He walked back to his car, muttering under his breath, and after a few moments, he pulled out his radio. Jake stood still, his heartbeat steady. He knew the footage would clear everything up. Karen, on the other hand, was losing her composure fast. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Look," she whispered harshly, "why don't we just let this go? No need to drag this out, right?" Jake tilted his head, amusement flickering in his chest. "You mean no need to drag this out for you?" Karen's eye twitched. The radio crackled, and Collins's expression darkened as he listened. The dispatch had seen the footage. They knew. Karen must have sensed it, because she suddenly changed tactics again. "You know what, officer?" she said, laughing lightly. "I just remembered. I actually have the deed to this land back at home. I could totally bring it over. I mean, you wouldn't want to arrest someone for a simple mix-up, would you?" Collins turned to her, one brow raised. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation on you right now that proves this is your land?" Karen froze. A beat of silence. Then, "Well, not on me, but—" Collins cut her off. "Then you'll understand if I take a look at the documentation he has." Jake handed over his papers without hesitation. The real deed. The one that had his name on it. Collins examined it, flipping through the pages. Then, without a word, he walked back to his patrol car, grabbed a clipboard, and started writing. Karen panicked. "Wait! What are you doing?" "Writing a citation," Collins said, not even looking up. "Trespassing, false police report, and wasting police resources." Karen's jaw dropped. "Wait, what?" "You're charging me—" Jake crossed his arms. "That's what happens when you lie to the police." Karen's face turned red, Her lips pressed so tightly together they nearly disappeared. "You can't do this," she hissed at Collins. I know my rights. My husband's a lawyer." Collins finally looked up, his expression blank. "Good for him. Maybe he can explain the charges to you." Jake had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Karen looked like she was going to explode. She whipped around to Jake, her face twisting in pure fury. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she spat. "You think you've won." Jake took a step forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I don't think I've won," he said. "I know I have." Karen shook with rage, but she had no way out. Collins ripped the ticket from his clipboard, handed it to her, and said 6 words that made Jake's entire day. "Court date is in 2 weeks." Karen's hands trembled as she snatched the paper away, spinning on her heel and storming toward her car. Jake exhaled, finally letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Collins turned to him, giving a small nod. "If she comes back, call us. We'll handle it." Jake smirked. "Oh, I will." Karen sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust, and the reality that she had just made a very, very expensive mistake. Jake watched Karen's car disappear down the road, her tires kicking up dust like a storm of entitlement. He could still hear her screeching complaints fading into the distance, but that wasn't his problem anymore. She had her citation, her court date, and most importantly, she had no excuse to ever step foot on his land again. Or so he thought. The next morning, as Jake walked out onto his porch with a cup of coffee, he nearly spit it out at what he saw. Karen, again, standing on his land like nothing had happened. Only this time, she wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit stood beside her, his arms crossed, his face set in a stern frown. He looked like the kind of guy who wore his ego like a second skin. Jake already knew who he was before Karen even opened her mouth. "My husband would like to have a word with you," she announced, her voice thick with triumph. "You might want to listen carefully. He's a lawyer." Jake sighed, rubbing his temple. "Of course he is." The man, Daniel Langley, adjusted his tie like he was about to give a closing argument in a courtroom. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "my wife has informed me that there's been a misunderstanding regarding this property. As I understand it, you—" "Nope," Jake interrupted, cutting him off without hesitation. "There's no misunderstanding. She was trespassing. She lied to the cops. End of story." Karen gasped like he had just slapped her across the face. "How dare you interrupt him?" she shrieked. "Do you even realize who you're talking to?" Jake smirked. Yeah, a man who should have taught his wife to follow the law. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Look, I don't want this to turn into a legal battle," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But if you continue to harass my wife over a simple mistake, I'll have no choice but to file a lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress." Jake almost laughed. "Are you serious?" Karen crossed her arms. "Dead serious." Jake tilted his head. "Okay then, let's play this out. What exactly do you think you're going to sue me for?" Daniel straightened his tie. "Harassment, defamation, and for emotionally distressing my wife with unwarranted police action." Jake let that sit for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and held it up. A video started playing. Clear as day, the security footage showed Karen waltzing onto his land, ignoring his warnings, and calling 911 under false pretenses. The best part? Her smug little voice on the recording. "Arrest him, officer. He's on MY land." Daniel's smug confidence wavered. Karen's face turned ghost white. Jake smirked. "So tell me, counselor, do you really want to take this to court? Because I'd love to see a judge's face when I show them this." Karen lost it. "This is illegal," she shrieked, pointing at his phone. "You can't just record people without permission." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose, realizing just how badly his wife had screwed up. "Karen," he muttered, voice tight, "stop talking." Jake couldn't hold back his laugh anymore. I don't need permission to record on my own property. But hey, if you want to talk about lawsuits, maybe I should see you both for trespassing and filing a false police report. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Daniel's confidence was officially gone. He exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "Look," he said, his voice lower now. "We don't need to take this any further. If you just drop the charges, we can all walk away from this without wasting time in court." Jake grinned. "That's funny, because I don't recall filing any charges. Just the cops giving her a citation." Karen scowled. "Just drop it. You got your little moment of victory, okay? Just let it go." Jake took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You don't get to tell me what to do on my land," he said. "You don't get to walk all over people and expect no consequences. You lost. Deal with it." Karen seethed, her hands trembling. But Daniel put a hand on her shoulder, his expression resigned. "Let's go," he muttered. Karen spun toward him. "Are you serious? You're just going to let him win?" Daniel's patience had officially run out. "Karen, for God's sake, get in the car." For the first time, she didn't argue. Jake watched as Daniel led his furious wife back to the car. The engine roared to life, and just before they sped off, Karen rolled down the window. "This isn't over," she hissed. Jake smirked. "Yeah, it is." The car peeled out of his driveway, disappearing down the road. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Hopefully, that was the last he'd see of her. But something told him that Karen Langley wasn't the type to give up that easily. Jake had hoped that was the last he'd see of Karen Langley, but deep down he knew better. People like her didn't just walk away. They simmered, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And sure enough, she proved him right. 3 days later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. He glanced up from his porch and immediately felt his stomach tighten. Karen was back. But this time, she wasn't alone. A black SUV idled near the edge of his property, its headlights casting eerie beams across the land. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, smug as ever. 2 men in official-looking suits stood next to her, their expressions unreadable. Jake took a deep breath, setting down his beer before pushing off the porch railing. He didn't have time for whatever insanity she had cooked up this time. As he approached, one of the men stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter?" Jake nodded. "That's me." The man flashed a business card. "I'm Michael Trent, County Zoning Commissioner." Jake's brow furrowed. "Okay." Karen's smirk widened. "Turns out you've got some legal issues with your land." Jake didn't blink. "That's so." Trent nodded, glancing down at a folder in his hand. "We received an anonymous complaint about zoning violations on this property." Jake didn't need to guess who made that complaint. Karen's voice was practically dripping with satisfaction. "I'm just looking out for the community, Jake. Wouldn't want anyone breaking the law now, would we?" Jake clenched his jaw, but kept his voice even. "What violations?" Trent flipped open the folder, scanning the documents. "It seems there's a question regarding your boundary lines. Your fencing project may be encroaching on public land." Jake barely contained a laugh. Of course, Karen had dug up some old zoning technicality and was trying to use it against him. "Uh-huh," he said, crossing his arms. "And let me guess, if my fence is off by an inch, I get fined?" Trent's expression was neutral. "If there's a confirmed violation, you could be required to remove the fence entirely." Karen beamed. "Oh, what a shame. And here I was thinking you were so careful with your property rights." Jake took a slow, deliberate breath. He wasn't going to let her see him sweat. Instead, he pulled out his phone. Karen's smirk faltered. "What are you doing?" Jake tapped his screen, scrolling through his emails. Then he found exactly what he needed. "Here," he said, turning the phone around. "This is the official land survey I had done last month. By the county. Your county." Trent took the phone, his brow furrowing as he scanned the document. Karen, on the other hand, was starting to look nervous. Jake let the silence drag, then said, just loud enough for her to hear, "This land is exactly where it's supposed to be, and I have the paperwork to prove it." Trent looked between Jake, Karen, and the folder in his hands. "If this survey is accurate, then," he sighed, snapping the folder shut. "Mr. Carter, I apologize. It looks like there's no violation after all." Karen's face twisted in horror. "Wait, what?" Trent ignored her. "I'll close the complaint. No further action is needed." Karen's smirk was gone. She was seething, fists clenched at her sides. But, Jake turned to her, grinning ear to ear. "Guess you wasted your time on that one, huh?" Karen looked ready to explode. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Finally, she let out a sharp, frustrated screech, stomped back to her SUV, and slammed the door shut so hard the car shook. Jake chuckled as he watched her speed off, tires screeching as she vanished into the night. The zoning officer gave him a knowing look. "She's a real piece of work, huh?" Jake laughed. "You have no idea." Trent smirked. "Well, if she files another bogus complaint, you know who to call." Jake nodded, shaking his hand. "I appreciate it." As the SUV disappeared into the distance, Jake finally felt the weight of the past few days lift off his shoulders. Karen had thrown everything she had at him. Lies, threats, legal loopholes. And she had lost. For good. Jake took a deep breath, taking in the land around him. His land. His family's land. And for the first time in days, he could finally enjoy the peace and quiet without some entitled lunatic trespassing on it. Karen Langley might have thought she could bully, lie, and manipulate her way into getting what she wanted. But in the end, she walked away with nothing,